This week on Act Out, human rights violations are rife in Alabama prisons. Meanwhile, the Alabama Department of Corrections continues to overcrowd these torture centers while blaming mistreatment on staff shortages. Next up, we are effectively laminating our planet in plastic. And while the public recognition of plastic's evil and long life is growing, there are several aspects of this industry that we just don't talk about, and we really need to. From tweets to marching in the streets, this is Act Out.
Rockets! Blockade! Bulldozers swarm outside the checkpoint gate. A noise flash broke the hush and blew me into the street. I awoke next to the body of my baby. No!
Welcome to Act Out. I'm Eleanor Goldfield, and this is your tipping point. It's no secret that our prison system hides a vast abyss of human rights abuses behind its militarized and privatized walls. And Alabama is one of the most infamous states when it comes to grotesque prison conditions and practices. On April 2nd, a DOJ report concluded that Alabama prisons constitute cruel and unusual punishment, a violation of the Eighth Amendment. The extent of torture outlined in the report is horrific. Inmates being thrown into solitary confinement at the whim of prison guards, practices such as being chained to a bucket for days without being able to move, sexual assault and harassment, a total indifference to extreme physical and/or mental health issues. Indeed, in a 15-month period between 2018 and 2019, 15 male prisoners committed suicide in Alabama. In early May, a U.S. district judge released a 210-page ruling that highlights the failure of Alabama prison officials to comply with even their own directives on suicide prevention and solitary confinement. The history of this case is replete with evidence of directives given and corrective action plans created that have been doomed to irrelevance because of a lack of follow-through to ensure the directives were obeyed and the plans put into action. The case is much the same for other torture endured by inmates in Alabama, including women. For instance, the Tutwiler Prison for Women was the focus of an investigation already 5 years ago that brought to light unabated staff on prisoner sexual abuse and harassment in an atmosphere where the women at Tutwiler universally fear for their safety. Today, according to women on the inside, the stagnant hopelessness and despair remains. As is the case with so-called bucket detail, solitary confinement, and other torture methods, the Alabama Department of Corrections, or ADOC, claims that it's just about a lack of staff, rather than a psychopathic culture that promotes violence and moves in the shadows of total and utter unaccountability. ADOC also doesn't seem to think that overcrowded prisons are to blame, the gross cornerstone of the for-profit prison industrial complex. For instance, Tutwiler's original design had an operating capacity of 478 inmates in its 2 sections. As of last December, its total inmate population count was 876. But rather than move to alleviate the nearly double capacity strain that only exacerbates violence, ADOC is holding people in prison longer. One inmate who remains incarcerated despite being eligible for release told local Alabama media, "It doesn't make any sense. I fit all the criteria. I have a job waiting for me and a place to stay. I have family and friends who will support me. It's like they're just moving bodies around in here." That's exactly what they're doing. When profit is king, humans are just the numbers on their prisoner files. And this dehumanization extends beyond prison walls as well. The extortion of family members on the outside is apparently a common practice. One woman who called herself Jane, for fear of retribution against her son who is imprisoned for speaking to the media, told Truth Out that she's been extorted by lieutenants and guards for over $10,000. "Guards stabbed my son. Then I got a call from a lieutenant who said things would get worse for him if I didn't send money," she said. Other family members echoed this experience, and I wonder if that too is due to a lack of staff. And Alabama may be one of the worst perpetrators of prison torture, but they're hardly the only ones. Prisons in this country are so far removed from the concept of rehabilitation, it'd be like walking into a drug rehab facility and just getting stabbed in the eye with a heroin needle. As we've talked about on the show before, the problem isn't staff. The problem isn't even decision makers who fail to pass down regulations. The problem is the ingrained culture and power dynamic of the prison system. You can't fix this with more guards. You can't fix this with a bill telling guards to be nicer. After all, we do already have the Eighth Amendment. The only way to really address this problem is to address that cornerstone of our system: profit. As long as it's profitable to lock people up, to make bank off of high recidivism rates that essentially just move those bodies around the system, we won't see an end to the horrific, torturous practices of our prison system. As we've covered on this show before, there are people doing this work. And in Alabama, those people are coming together on May 13th outside of the Alabama state capitol in Montgomery. And if you're in the area, go to Facebook and look up March/Rally on Alabama State Capitol in order to find out more information. Moving on, we all know about plastic. We've heard about and seen the unbelievably massive pile of plastic shit floating in the ocean. We've heard reports about dead animals being cut open to reveal a horror show of indigestible human error. Less talked about, however, are, for instance, microplastics, the name given to fragments of plastic that are smaller than a pinky fingernail. A 2016 study showed that we have 37 times the previously estimated amount of microplastics in the ocean alone, between 93 and 236,000 metric tons. In April of this year, Nature Geoscience released a study documenting the shocking spread of microplastics. There's literally plastic falling from the sky. Meanwhile, the plastics industry is only growing, with businesses projecting a rise in plastics production as we continue to literally laminate the planet with our mistakes. And thanks to cozy, if not totally intertwined, relationships with the fossil fuel industry, the sheer extent of this polluted and toxic industry is impossible to underestimate. Here to talk about the less talked about aspects of plastic is Stephen Feit, staff attorney at the Center for Environmental Law here in Washington, D.C. Take a look.
Almost all plastic begins either as oil, gas, or coal, and then almost all of that's oil and gas. And so for oil, it comes from the well, goes to the refinery, is either some of the fuel oil turned directly into the precursor chemicals for plastic production, or is turned into naphtha, which is then fed to steam crackers, which create the base chemicals for plastic production, ethylene, propylene, things like that.
And naphtha is a derivative of oil?
Yes, yeah, it is one of the products of a refinery. And then on the gas side, you drill for natural gas, you get methane, and then also ethane, propane, the rest of those hydrocarbons. And those, again, can be fed into steam crackers, turned into ethylene or propylene, and then turned into plastic.
Wow, so how much of, you mentioned that it's oil, gas, and coal, predominantly oil and gas. Do you have an idea of how much of oil gas production goes specifically to plastics?
Yes, so the numbers are a bit dicier for gas. In the U.S., a conservative estimate that we have is about 1.8%, but that is just the material feedstock. It doesn't account for the energy used in the process. For oil, globally, it is in the 4 to 8% range, which is a lot for now, but what's I think really even scarier is the way in which plastic is the growth opportunity from the vantage point of the major oil and gas companies. Mm-hmm. And so I think only 44% of ethane in the United States is used. The rest of it is either vented, flared, or rejected back into the gas stream. Now companies are looking to build, steam crackers and new expanded facilities to use this ethane and turn it into ethylene and then plastics. On the oil side, projections of growth suggest that by 2050, at least 20% of oil will be used for plastic production, representing 50% of the growth in oil demand between now and 2050.
Which really goes back to that idea that it's not something, it's so often overlooked because people talk about, we have to remove our transportation and our energy from oil and gas, but that leaves the whole plastic sector completely free to grow, so to speak. Mm-hmm. Refinery toxins and chemicals are another overlooked side of things is not just the raw materials, but the refinery toxins and chemicals. Talk about what kind of chemicals are we talking about here?
There's a lot of them. I think there are 353 chemicals used in the, I forget if it's oil or oil and gas production and refining process. Things like persistent organic pollutants, so POPs, and polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, or PAHs. I mean, there are so many that talking about individual ones maybe obscures just the sheer degree of exposure that these facilities are causing, both in the communities that are around them, for the workers at the facilities, and then also at the, further down the life cycle of plastic, the use case for plastic as it gets into our food, or as it leaks into our oceans, our agricultural soils, and our airways, or if it's incinerated, how those chemicals are aggressively released into the environment.
And sort of jumping back to that idea of the oil and gas industries putting more of their interest into plastics, another thing that the report talks about, or a different report talks about, how corporations vertically integrate plastics with fossil fuels. Can you talk about that aspect of it?
Yeah, so plastic really should be thought of as a fossil fuel product line. The companies that make it, and oftentimes the geographic distribution of these facilities are tightly clustered. So Exxon, Chevron, BP, Shell, all of them have a chemicals division, and chemicals is mostly plastic. Or Dow DuPont, or INEOS. Dow, I believe, owns essentially a wholly owned energy company that it uses to source for both energy and then for feedstocks. INEOS, a chemical company in the UK, is pushing for UK fracking to feed its plastic production processes. And so they're integrated from a corporate umbrella perspective, but also geographically, because ethane, it's a bit difficult to move long distances, it's expensive. Oil refineries produce a number of products that oftentimes are then processed very close to where they're either fractionated in the case of gas or refined in the case of oil. So you get these hotspots like in Texas and Louisiana, or in Appalachia and the Ohio River Valley, where all of these facilities are tightly clustered, leading especially to some really severe environmental justice problems for those communities around the area.
Yeah, and it just totally exacerbates that concept of a sacrifice zone, both in terms of humans and of course, the ecosystems that we're a part of. And another thing about the report that I found really interesting, the recent report, the dangers of toxic recycling, which leads to these chemicals, these smaller particles that you just mentioned, because we tend to think of recycling as a good thing, right? Like, oh, I recycled all my plastic, so I don't have to worry about that. Almost like you get a clean slate, right? Talk about that misconception and the dangers of it.
So I think there's maybe 3 levels to this. So recycling has to be part of the solution, but it has its problems, right? If a toxic additive or plasticizer in something that gets recycled remains in that material and then ends up in a toy or something else made from recycled plastic, that's a big problem, and that's a toxic exposure hazard. But the bigger issue with recycling is just that it itself can't handle current production levels for plastic, and it can't handle the intended increase in plastic production, which, I mean, at the rate suggested by the World Economic Forum and other projections, might be a quadrupling of plastic production from 2015 to 2050. So we're talking about a really enormous expansion. And to date, I think 9 or 9.5% of all plastic ever produced has been recycled. Most of it is not. In the US, recycling rates have dropped. They're somewhere in the single digits. I forget exactly where. And not for lack of us putting, a bottle in a blue bin. It's that recycled plastic competes with virgin plastic, and companies are producing more of it and investing in new facilities to produce even more. So recycling just simply can't provide the solution at the scale that it's often imagined it can. But then the third level of this is just that companies have made a number of announcements sort of in response to calls for circular economy initiatives and things like that, that they're going to make their products more recyclable, which is good because a lot of products simply aren't. But if they're using virgin plastic to make those products, because they're recyclable is, I guess, an improvement, but that still leads to an increasing demand and production of plastic that ends up somewhere. And unfortunately, the solution proposed by the industry as part of their circular economy efforts is, instead of just continuing to grow that circle, is to use incineration as an end-of-life solution, which is horribly problematic from a climate perspective because it's enormously greenhouse gas emissions intense, and then it's just a complete toxic hazard for surrounding areas, for the water, for the soils. So recycling is part of the solution, but it has limits to how much it can accommodate.
Right, and it's interesting that you point out that the industry is spending so much money on creating so-called virgin plastic rather than finding solutions for recycling. And I'm reminded of that documentary that was shown in China with regards
Under the Dome?
I don't remember what it was called, but it was about how they recycle. They take care of our recycling. And
Yes.
there was like an image or a shot of a little girl who was coughing and sick because she spent a lot of time with her parents at this recycling facility. And this perpetuated, a large scale fight against China having to deal with our recycling. So they kind of shut the door on that. And so but that was also a shock, I think, for American audiences who saw that, to think, wow, I just thought that a recycling center would be clean and nice and fresh and green, and it's really not.
No, and that's had a number of consequences, because up until last year, China was accepting, I think, half or more than half of the world's plastic waste that was traded internationally. And what that's meant now is that there has been a scramble to find markets for that plastic. Because again, no one's going to pay to recycle it if no one then wants to buy the recycled plastic. But this is leading to some really severe problems, as that plastic is now spilling out around Southeast Asia, in India, and those communities are not prepared to receive it. So, we're talking about just plastic covering entire fields and just open burning of plastic to get potentially any metals inside or things of value, or even just to get it out of the way because there's nothing else to do, which is, again, enormously problematic from a climate perspective, but especially difficult for the people living there. Inhaling those fumes and dealing with all of that fallout, it's become a really, catastrophic problem.
Yeah, and of course, this also speaks to the connectivity of issues. This reverberates into public health issues. It reverberates into systemic racism, and all of these issues being connected by something as seemingly simple as plastic. Speaking of the idea of recycling and making these things smaller and more manageable, I want to talk about microplastics, which is the name given to fragments of plastic that are smaller than a pinky fingernail. And a 2016 study showed that we have 37 times previously estimated amounts of microplastics in the ocean alone, somewhere between 93,000 and 236,000 metric tons. And the new report from CIEL highlights that insidious nature of microplastics. We inhale it, we ingest it. Talk about the varied dangers of this almost invisible scourge.
Sure. So I think there's a lot to dive into there. Microplastic has been found basically everywhere. It's in water, it's in bottled water, and it's in tap water, and the kinds of plastics we're finding are different in different places, suggesting that this isn't just one problem from one source. And we know that the additives and the plasticizers in the plastic material are endocrine disrupting chemicals, carcinogens, all sorts of really horrible substances that do really terrible things to the human body. We're also getting evidence that the plastic itself, just those fundamental polymers, can be doing damage, again, to our bodies, to our organs, if ingested or otherwise end up in our bodies. And there's even, I've seen some evidence that bacteria can, sorb into or get into these microplastic particles. And unfortunately, that's that's what we know. There's a lot that we know, the questions we have to be asking, but we don't yet know the answers to, about how these particles move in mammalian tissue and in human tissue, as opposed to things like fish or shellfish, where we have a bit better data. But I mean, the other part of this that really scares me is, from a climate perspective, what these microplastics may be doing. Was a first of its kind study towards the second half of last year that demonstrated that plastic in the surface oceans off-gases methane and ethylene. And so the numbers from that study weren't especially large, but it was really, really clear that the surface area of the plastic emitting or doing the off-gassing sort of defines how much gas is getting emitted. And so I worry quite a bit that as we produce ever more plastic and it gets broken down into ever smaller pieces, the amount of just emissions from the environment that we can't do anything about may be growing substantially. But I think even scarier is what might be happening to marine food webs. We know that some of the fish and other sea creatures that humans end up eating can have microplastics in them. And of course, we've seen this with mercury. The bioaccumulation in marine food webs is really severe. But there's an even scarier part of it potentially, which is the interference with phytoplankton and zooplankton, where that base of the food web is also one of the primary ways that the oceans absorb carbon dioxide from the air. And so there's evidence that these microplastics are disrupting that process and maybe really detrimentally affecting the base of this food web, which has implications for human health from an ingestion perspective, but from a climate perspective also suggests some really severe effects on the ocean's ability to absorb carbon dioxide. So I think the short answer is it's really scary stuff. And maybe the worst part of it, or the scariest part about it, is that unlike other problems that we've created for ourselves, there's not a good solution other than to stop doing more harm.
Right.
We can't just take a sieve and get microplastics out of the shores. It doesn't work like that. So this is a problem we're going to have to deal with. And if industry's plans proceed as they wish, we're going to have to deal with it much, much, much more.
I wanted to talk about what you said earlier about the fact that they're really pushing for more plastic, because there's an ongoing conversation about how oil and gas is no longer viable for energy. Even the companies themselves are starting to invest in renewable energy sources because they themselves realize, it's getting more expensive to frack, and the typical ways of accessing oil are diminishing. And but this seems to be something that isn't the case for plastics. But in that same vein, is there any indication that the industry is interested in plastic alternatives? Or are they just saying, you know what, no, we're going to keep, even if it gets more expensive, we're going to stay with plastic? I
am not sure what they have said or announced specifically, but if you look at where their money's going, I actually just checked the numbers this morning to make sure they hadn't been updated. The American Chemistry Council, which is the industry body that represents the petrochemical and plastics, those industries, the chemistry industries, releases numbers for investments in the U.S. since 2010 linked to shale gas. And as of September 2018, over $202 billion have been announced for investment in 333 either expansions, new facilities, or restarts of facilities. So whether or not they're talking about alternatives, the plan is to expand production capacity and make ever more plastic.
With that, what are some things, it paints a bleak picture, which is, unfortunately mostly what I do on my show is I paint bleak pictures for people. But I also like to give people a ray of hope a little bit, in terms of, hey, we might all die, but here's something we can do about it. Is there anything to do in terms of combating this that you see as a hopeful path?
Yes, quite a bit. And I think you can see it upstream and downstream, especially. Upstream, we see a kind of resistance to these projects that we haven't seen historically because, as you mentioned, a lot of these facilities are specifically cited to take advantage of communities which are marginalized, which may be communities of color or low income, where they don't have the infrastructure to fight back.
Yeah.
And then there's questions of tax incentives and all these things. But now we're seeing really from the grassroots mobilization of people saying, no, we either don't want this greenfield site developed into the largest ethane cracker facility in the world, which is what's happening in Portland or Gregory, Texas, or we have too many of these facilities. We don't want any more. We don't want more cancer and more asthma and more disease in our communities. So that is really inspiring because, frankly, the best solution to the plastics crisis is source reduction. Right. But we're also seeing incredible innovations in what are called zero waste communities, essentially systems designed to figure out how to satisfy people's needs and eliminate waste. And that doesn't just include plastic, but plastic is kind of the primary culprit of that. And we're seeing these all over the place in the US, but in all over the global South. And what's especially inspiring is that the solutions are locally thought up, locally grown, and some of them are portable, some of them aren't, but that's kind of the model of how getting out of this crisis is going to work, because there isn't one solution, but there are lots of solutions, and what works for some people may work for others.
For a more in-depth look at the CIEL reports on plastic, go to ciel.org. And that will do it for this week's Dose of Dissent. Reminder, the best way to stay up to date on our work is to sign up for the newsletter at the address below. To those who have donated, thank you so much. Please do keep spreading the word in order to ensure our ability to keep acting out. From the Devil's Den, good night and act out. And real quick, to keep independent, non-corporatized media like this show going, visit patreon.com/actout.
I can hear the boots are stomping. Come on, boys, let's get some roster through. I can't stand to hear my father cry anymore. Time we left for nothing, motherfuckers dead in the road. We've been backing up inch by inch, we got nowhere else to go. It's been too many years since you pushed and served my shove. I'm not a violent man, but